This is part 2 in a 2-part series in how to make plaster molds and lasts. This part will focus on taking the mold that we created in part 1 and making a last. For this process I used petroleum jelly, 2 dowels, and the plaster molds that I made in part 1, along with a tub of some sort with a flat bottom to contain any messes. When I finished my molds, I wanted to start right away on making the lasts, but they were still a bit damp because the weather was cold and rainy. So I simply put them on a rack and put them in the oven at 220 degrees for a couple of hours, and that dried them out sufficiently. After recording the approximate depth on the dowel with a pencil line, I took the petroleum jelly and smeared it all over that portion of the dowel, including the bottom of the dowel. My plaster molds had gaps in between the two pieces, the bottom and the tops, and so I took some masking tape to tape the two pieces together to cover up the gaps. Once the molds have all been taped and are ready, you get the plaster ready by mixing it in a container and pouring it into the mold. You can see in this video that the plaster is actually quite thick. Looking back, I would have made it considerably thinner, as it's much easier to fill in the space. Because my plaster mixture was so thick, I needed to occasionally shake the plaster down and jiggle it into place so that it would cover all of the spaces inside the mold. After I finished pouring all of the plaster, I took the dowels with the ends with the petroleum jelly pointing down and stuck them into the new plaster after it had set for several minutes so that it was no longer liquidy but somewhat firm. After the plaster sets for a bit more, I continue to twist the dowels without misshaping the hole so that they do not stick too much. After the plaster is hardened, you may remove the dowels and then begin removing the plaster mold, which was the original plaster wrap, off of the last. This is a pretty simple process. You just work your way around, peeling off any of the old wrap as well as any masking tape that you used. Well, this is the final piece. You can see here there's some parts where the plaster did not fill in properly here, and there's a big divot here. I'll fill these pieces in with some clay, and that will take care of that. One problem I did notice right away though was that this is not an accurate depiction of my foot. This is way too thin. My foot is more like this thick. So I think what I did was I put the top and the bottom pieces of the molds together, and I put them in too close together. I didn't measure it, and I didn't have an accurate way to do that. So it ended up being too thin. So looking back, I would probably do it this way. I would go ahead and make that bottom piece just as I did in part one. And then I would, instead of doing the top piece completely separate, I would keep the bottom piece underneath my foot after it's hardened, and then put the do the top mold on top of that. So that what you're basically doing is you have both pieces then as you're putting the top piece on. It's going to be more difficult, of course, to connect the two because it's on your foot. But I still think that would give you a better overall structure of your foot and more accurate. I think doing the bottom though is still good to do it separate because that's one of the most important parts, especially if you're going to be doing the carbon fiber sole. And I think doing it separately will give you the most accurate shape of your foot. Just to give you a quick demonstration, I did this other one last year, and this I did in one full piece of plaster wrap. And so it's more accurate in terms of the overall shape, but the detail and the curvature that it gave me is not as accurate, especially on this bottom piece where this is essentially quite flat. There's no detail in here, and the arch is not as detailed. Comparing that to this, I would much prefer using this. So considering that, I'd try that other way of doing it and see if that works the next time I try it.